you know, it's 24 hours. Anyway, it's good to see you all.
I know. I was just looking at all the beautiful faces.
Yeah, it's great to see everybody. It's an honor to be here.
Sí, ¿verdad?
The honor is all ours. So I'm gonna begin. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Magdalena Solano. My pronouns are she, hers, and ella, and I'm honored to be your moderator for today's conversation. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that the Balboa Art Conservation Center and the Centro Cultural de la Raza reside in the unceded ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation, also known as San Diego, California. And I would like to thank them for their stewardship, past and present. I would also like to acknowledge with respect the traditional and unceded territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples in a territory that is now also known as Denver, Colorado, where many of us are joining from today. This session is the fourth and final panel in the Preserving Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx Art Conversations on Conservation. This program is a collaborative effort between the Balboa Art Conservation Center, the Centro Cultural de la Raza, and the many wonderful participants who have graciously agreed to join us throughout the month of April to open a dialogue on what art conservation and cultural preservation look like for the Chicana, Chicano, and Chicanx community. This program is funded by the California Humanities and the City of San Diego Commission for Arts and Culture. And I would like everyone to use the chat space to share all your ideas and curiosities. These sessions are being recorded and all will be available to view on the Balboa Art Conservation Center's website. Today's topic is ¿A dónde vamos? Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, setting intentions for cultural preservation. This final session will reflect on concepts and talking points from the previous sessions, while also providing a moment to consider what the future looks like and actionable next steps for the setting of guidelines for Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx art conservation. We are led in this conversation by a group of visionary leaders long committed to realizing this important work, including Cecilia Rodriguez, artist, co-founder, and co-director of Las Maestras Center for Chicanx Indigenous Thought, art and social practice at UC Santa Barbara. We'll get to hear about existing models for tribal communities from Brandi McDonald, Senior Director of Decolonizing Initiatives at the Museum of Us, efforts to make the field of museum and conservation more inclusive and representative of Black, Indigenous, and communities of colors from Alessandra Mendoza, Director of San Diego Mesa College Museum Studies Program, and Bianca Garcia, Program Manager for the Andrew W. Mellon Opportunity for Diversity in Conservation, an initiative of the UCLA Getty Program in the conservation of cultural heritage. Myself, Bianca Garcia, and Leticia Gomez Franco from BACC, and Josephine Palamantes, activist, historian, and founder of the Chicano Park Museum, will be joining live from the Latinos and Heritage Conservation Conference in Denver, Colorado, to highlight long-standing, ongoing, and impactful efforts to preserve Chicano, Chicana, and Chicanx culture in San Diego region and beyond. So we're not going to go around and have everyone give a brief introduction of themselves. So I'm just going to call on folks, and for the interest of time, there is a lengthier bio in our page that we'll link to in the chat. So we'll begin with Leticia. Can we begin with you?
Yes, of course. My name is Leticia Gomez Franco. Sorry, I'm the Executive Director of the Balboa Art Conservation Center. And I am really excited to be here. I'm really blessed to be in communion with all of you amazing panelists. Thank you to all of those attending and all of those who will watch this recording later and the rest of our recordings for this series. Very important conversation and a reminder, as we say, this is only the beginning for BACC engaging in this work.
Thank you, Leticia. Bianca, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Vancouver Garcia. My pronouns are she, her, hers, or ella, and I am both the Associate Conservator Paintings at the Balboa Art Conservation and also Program Manager for the Andrew W. Mellon Opportunity for Diversity and Conservation Initiative, as Magdalena said before. And I'm really happy. I've been moderating some of the past sessions. So today I'm sitting on the panelist side and I am so excited to join you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. Now we'll move on to Alessandra Mendoza. Would you kindly introduce yourself, please?
Yes, good morning, everybody. My name is Alessandra Moctezuma, she, hers, ella pronouns. I am professor of fine art, museum studies, and also Chicano art at San Diego Mesa College. I'm also the director of the art gallery and have curated many exhibitions of Chicano art. And I'm also an independent curator and an artist. And it's really great to be here with everybody.
Great to have you. Thank you. I'll move on to the next on my screen. Brandi McDonald, would you kindly introduce yourself, please?
Alito Chokma Sanofa, Brandi McDonald, Chicasasaya, Chatasaya. Hi, I'm Brandi. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation with ancestral ties to the Choctaw Nation. I'm the Senior Director of Decolonizing Initiatives at the Museum of Us. It's an honor to be here with y'all. So I'm fangirling over everyone in this space. And so thank you. As someone who's not a part of this community, I just feel really honored to be in this space and to be able to share some decolonial work in the context of the conversation.
Very well said, and likewise. So next on our screen, Cecilia Rodriguez, would you kindly introduce yourself, please?
Buenos dias, Celia Herrera, and I'm a visual artist, and I teach in Chicano studies at UCSB, and I'm the founder and co-director of Las Maestras Center for Chicana Indigenous Thought, Art, and Social Practice. And it's really wonderful to be here and have this conversation. It's something that right along the lines of what we intend and what our purpose is at Las Maestras Center, to think about the perspectives that we take as Chicanas. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Josie Palamantes, great to have you. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, Josephine Palamantes. Currently, I'm the board chair of the Chicano Park Museum and Cultural Center. I'm also a co-founder of Chicano Park, the Chicano Park Steering Committee, was a member of the Royal Chicano Air Force, and I basically do independent work, and all the work I'm doing with the museum right now is pretty much volunteer. So my time's pretty much captivated by administrative work until we hire staff at the museum.
Yes, and we can't wait to hear more about the Chicano Park Museum. So we're going to start today's, thank you all for introducing yourselves. That was great. We're going to hear more about everyone in the panel today, and we're going to start today's conversation with some highlights of work that is already in motion. And fortunately, there's a lot to talk about. More than half of us today are joining live from Denver, where the Latinos and Heritage Conservation Conference is about to kick off. Please raise your hand if you're in Denver at the moment. So to start us off, we're going to have Josephine Palamantes, co-founder of Latinos and Heritage Conservation and founder of the Chicano Park Museum, tell us about Latinos and Heritage Conservation. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Well, LHC basically started as a collective focused on local, state, and national policies. If we formulate it primarily at one of the National Trust Conference, and that was Desiree Smith Aranda and Laura Dominguez and Sarah Gould. And if you're at the conference, you'll meet them if you haven't already. And then through that process, she reached out to a number of us, Antonia Castañeda, myself, Eloy Torres, to begin formulating a discussion of how to build capacity for Latinos in Latino communities engaging in preservation work at the local, state, and national level, and to advocate for policy change at all levels of government that works for preservation of our communities. So over the years, this is our 4th conference. We had our first conference in Tucson, Arizona. The second one we did in Houston, Texas. Third one was Rhode Island. And then this one, we took a break. Conferences are usually every 2 years, but with the pandemic, we took a break and formulated really as a national collective. But we've recently incorporated. I'm no longer on the board just because my time is just too impacted right now. So I had to step back, but the board is a pretty strong board with regard to preservation and focusing on policy. And I think all of this gelled together after the National Park Service, National Park Service brought together a number of scholars to create the American Latino Theme Study. And that is a document that really talks about all the places that we've contributed to the development of this country, which had never been acknowledged in the past. And I think that's really where we're staying. I had the good fortune of afterwards being brought in by the Office of Historic Preservation here in California. And then we created a Latino theme study. So both of these documents are online. The one in California focuses on a multi-registration form, but it still carries the same thematic focus that the American Latino Theme Study did. So both of these, National Park Service, you should be able to look at the American Latino Theme Study. And in California, at the California Office of Historic Preservation, you can also look at the Latino Theme Study. And I'm not sure if other theme studies were done in other states, but that both of those documents serve as a guideline when you're putting forward a nomination to the National Register, or you're going for landmark status or anything along that way. So this organization has been very significant in impacting policy at the national level, especially with the National Park Service. And, federal government is like moving a block of steel with one hand, so it's been tough. So anyway, that's basically what they're doing. If you're not at the conference, I'm sure you can log on virtually, and that would be a good place to just kind of watch the themes and the context of what's being addressed at this conference. So we have a new director, and she will be announced at this conference. I'm sure I can announce it here because she's already listed, and that is Selah Casper out of Houston, Texas. And she did some work with the National Park Service. That was her previous employment. So all really good people doing some really good work. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you so much. I want to move this conversation to Alessandra. We're talking about investments and actions in preservation, and we can't really have this conversation without talking about the influence of Judy Bacas. You recently curated her retrospective at the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach. Would you tell us about your experience curating that exhibition, why having a retrospective is an important part of the preservation? And this exhibition is just one part of big efforts to currently underway to preserve Judy's work. The Lucas Museum of Narrative Art in LA recently acquired the archives for Judy's mural, The Great Wall, and the Mellon Foundation has awarded Judy $5 million as part of the Monuments Project to expand and preserve the Great Wall. The Social and Public Art Resource Center, or SPARC, has played such a huge role in putting all of this in motion. So much to unpack here. What can you share with us about this work that speaks to the importance of setting intentions and working towards conservation and preservation?
Yes, thank you for that question. So in curating Judy Bacas' retrospective at MOLA, we realized how important it was to take an approach where we have support from the academic world, scholars, from community organizations, Spark, the organization that she founded, and also from museums and conservation institutions. So it is a challenge for an artist to look back at 50 years of their career and figure out how are they going to preserve that legacy and how are they going to present it. And I think the first thing is to highlight all of those artists that that are so important. And now looking back at the Chicano movement, we were very lucky that we had a whole museum to present Judy's work. We also had a lot of challenges, which was that when artists are creating things like murals or paintings, a lot of times you're not thinking of, well, I'm going to prime the canvas so that this lasts 100 years, and I'm going to use the right materials. So one of the challenges that we realized in terms of conservation and preserving the artifacts and the artworks of that we're working with for Judy's exhibition was how important it was to have a collaboration with conservation entities like Balboa Park, the Balboa Art Conservation Center, to allow us to preserve those materials for future generations. And those are, I think the biggest problem with that is the lack of resources available for artists, Chicano artists, or artists who are not part of the, kind of large world, art world with the resources, the privileged art world. The other thing that we realized that it was very important for artists to document their work. We're very lucky that the Getty actually invested in documenting the half-mile-long mural, the Great Wall of Los Angeles. So they did the highest resolution images that they could. And with murals, it's really important to do that because murals are affected by the environment. Sometimes they are in buildings that get, demolished. Sometimes they get whitewashed. So documentation of the murals is really key and important. And having that documentation of the Great Wall of Los Angeles allowed us to create an immersive environment that kind of preserved that digitally. So the other thing that I had a lot of conversations with Judy about was the use of technology. That a lot of artists now at their fingertips, they have digital technologies that can allow them to think about creating works in different ways, where you can create a mural like Judy created several murals in the exhibition inside, some of them are in sites all over nationally. Some of them are here in San Diego, Los Angeles, but they're created digitally so they could be reproduced. So that's another aspect of conservation and preservation. What are the different materials, the different technologies at our disposal that will allow us to also preserve the waste and maybe maintain the integrity of the art, but also allow us to share it, replicate it, and protect it in that way. So those are some of the issues that we talked about. And also Judy had the foresight when she was working with Spark, the Social and Public Art Resource Center, and she was creating the Great Wall and the World Wall and many other projects, that she archived a lot of her materials. So that's also the history. It's not only also the objects, the artworks, the murals that need to be preserved, but I really do believe that the process, working with community, the value of those dialogues with other artists, with community, that is also crucial and essential for future generations of scholars, for the community, for the public to also have that information available. So it's really, I think, thinking of presenting the work, recognizing the work of Chicano artists, archiving that work, documenting it, also planning, as you create new pieces, what were the best materials to use, what is the maintenance that is needed, foresight, and utilizing, technologies that can assist us to better preserve the legacy of, Chicano art, and of course, indigenous art and other types of art. So that's, in a nutshell, it's like a big issue. But I also think that the lack of resources is something that needs to be addressed, and that resources usually go to the bigger entities. But that's why it's important, Judy tapped into the Getty, tapped into the Lucas Museum. So working with those organizations, museums that have the capacity, to support those efforts. And also very important to have community and the artists themselves involved in that process, so that it's there's an integrity to how all of these beautiful artworks and artifacts are preserved.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I also want to note that tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, the UCLA Getty Interdepartmental Program in the Conservation of Cultural Heritage will have a conversation, host a conversation with Judy Bacas on the creation, impact, and conservation of the Great Wall of Los Angeles. So that'll be a great thing to watch, and we'll link that in our chat. There it is. Oh, I think we need to change it to everyone. Okay. There we go. And okay, thank you. And we'll come back to, there's so much to talk about here. But quickly, Josie, we're gonna go back to you. We heard a little bit about the work to preserve the Great Wall mural in Los Angeles. And you have played a significant role in the struggle to preserve the murals of Chicano Park, from a historical designation to organizing efforts to securing funding for preservation. So can you please tell us a little bit about the work in this area?
Yeah, well, it was interesting, all of the effort to preserve. I must say I was not a historic preservationist, although I started getting into the field while I was working at the California Arts Council. But we were about to be wiped out. The museum, the murals were pretty much on the target when the governor, Pete Wilson, the previous governor, issued an edict to retrofit bridges and spans. And at that point, we figured, well, how could we save them? Well, strategically, there's a process that if any federal fundings are coming into an area, and if they affect a historic site, they must deal with regulations that are called the 106 regulations. And you can ask any engineer or anybody that does any kind of construction work, they do not want to deal with 106. So in California, Dr. Jim Fisher, who's a good friend of mine, actually did the work to identify the park and the murals. And he was looking at the bridge to be a natural historic site. He compromised on the bridge because they did need to do retrofitting, but he set the tone really that really lit a fire under me, because once that was preserved, they could not come in and just wipe out the park. The park's only 7.5, well, it's a little bit bigger now, acres wide. And the murals, if they were to come in and preserve them, to retrofit, they would have had to wrap the murals, which would have destroyed the murals and then lessened the space of the park. So when he finished his work at Caltrans, he told me, now you got to get it listed on the National Register. I didn't even know what the heck a National Register was. But once I realized what I had to do, I began working with the steering committee. Although I'm a member, I was not in San Diego at the time. And there's just a long story, but finally it took about 14 years to convince the community that this was a good thing for us. And we finally submitted it. 2013, we were listed on the National Register. And then I collaborated with Dr. Manny Galaviz, who's a professor now at Fullerton, and we gained landmark status. We didn't necessarily get funding for preservation, although what we're looking at right now is there was a legislative request in the governor's budget last year to find ways to support the Chicano Park Museum and Cultural Center, and then also to retrofit the murals. And in that sense, we were able to tap into those funds that are coming through the California Arts Council and Caltrans to do that kind of work. So it's very difficult to get preservation monies, I must say, and most of you that work in this field know that it's not an easy feat to do that. And I think Judy did an excellent job by tapping into the Getty and the Lucas, but not everybody has that access or understanding on how to do that. So I think the bottom line is really to start focusing on how to preserve our resources, both tangible and intangible resources, and documenting them right now, because there's stipulations in the National Trust that says you must be 50 years old before you can, really preserve stuff. When we did the Chicano Park murals, Chicano Park and the monumental murals, we were less than 50 years. So we had to go through a separate category to make the argument, which I did, and it was good and it was successful. But, when you don't have awareness of that process, it can be very daunting. And I think that's what, in terms of training the next generation, I think we have to start now and teaching them how to preserve now, so that when they're at a point that they can get additional resources, they at least have a history behind them. So just so you understand, it's a kind of a daunting process, but and we've got limited time on this panel to go through all of that. As Leticia said, we could probably do a whole conference on preservation. And I think Latinos in Heritage Conservation at this conference and past conferences have tried to do that. And if you're not involved with them, I would really encourage you to become a member, to just follow along in terms of policies, because it comes down to political policies. And it's really whoever's in the president's seat, whoever's in your governor's seat, where you start to finesse to find ways to serve. And I think we're at a pivotal point right now with people focusing on racial and cultural equity. I think we are all at a place right now that we can gain and benefit and set a precedent for our communities going forward. We can get into more detail, because I know this is not a whole long panel. When I talk to you a little bit more about the museum, I'll tell you what we're doing to preserve.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, that was a great start to this conversation. And yes, like Leticia said, we hope to just plant seeds and move the conversation forward even just a little bit. But we've talked a lot about the efforts to preserve community cultural property, and those efforts have been significant. There's so much to learn about how to maximize those lessons and apply them to a larger context. From a community-wide perspective, we can also take lessons from other cultural communities. A very important one is tribal and indigenous peoples' efforts and successes in setting standards for the care, preservation, and acknowledgement of cultural materials. So Brandi, you are the Senior Director of Decolonizing Initiatives at the Museum of Us. You've explained decolonization, especially as it applies to museums and the cultural sector, as an ongoing process. Can you tell us more about decolonization and how it plays a role at the Museum of Us and beyond? And what are some of the challenges in doing this work from inside institutions? What is the role that decolonization plays to approaching collections and conservation? And finally, how have tribal communities set their own guidelines for the care and preservation of the cultural materials? So much to talk about, but could you please share something with us?
Big question. And I'll try not to take up too much space. But I think, so essentially kind of how we approach it at the Museum of Us and how I approach decolonizing practices and our team approaches decolonizing practices is that decolonization, as it's written in the dictionary, is like this noun, but we really, like you said, it's a process, it's an action, it's a verb, but we're decolonizing. it's not the end of a deliverable. Once you finish your grant report, you're done and you're moving to equity or you're moving to something else. It is constant. It is a part of our work from this point forward. And we're always working to be better and working with communities and recognizing that communities' wants and needs continue to shift based upon the impacts of colonization, based upon their priorities. And so really recognizing that culture is fluid, communities' wants and needs may be fluid, and they may change over time. And that is what our process needs to be as well. That museums are these mountains you talked about. We talked a little bit how the government is this like concrete wall, right? Or this steel wall. Museums are mountains. They just slow moving. And so really thinking about decolonizing practices, the way I think about it is thinking about it in the relationship to water. It can be a drop of water that eventually makes a cave. It can be a river that carves through this massive mountain and creates a valley. And so just thinking about what that looks like, it varies depending on the community. And so our work with the Kumeyaay peoples is maybe different than our work with the Lakota peoples or the Eastern Band of Cherokee peoples, because their cultural practices and protocols may be different in terms of how they curate, in terms of how they look at conservation and what conservation means to them. And so we have a general base on how we approach cultural resources, minimal disturbance. So we're not trying to continue to perpetuate chaos, recognizing that they're more than inanimate objects, that they are connected to their communities, past, present, and future. And so making sure that we're not just moving so we don't lose something, we're moving in order to make sure that we are honoring everything that it holds. So we're, again, minimal disturbance. We're also recognizing, and I think what Josephina had said was the intangible and the tangible, is recognizing that all of this knowledge, there's tangible heritage, intangible heritage, and that's the intellectual property of the communities. And so one of the things that we're working on right now is working on reframing and changing our Maya exhibit with Maya consultants from all over the world. Protocols may be different, the wants and needs may be different as well, but thinking about what that looks like in terms of access policy to their cultural resources. Display practices, handling practices are different than, say, I think about my tribal community as a Chickasaw person. Some of our cultural protocols around different items are different than some of the Maya cultural protocols. We also have a muralist that's going, and right now she's working on putting a 17.5 foot by 12 foot mural on the wall, on our right wall, and then a 12 by 12 on the left wall. And we're working on our contract. And so when we think about conservation, we also have a seismic retrofit somewhere in our future of our building, which would mean that that wall would maybe need to come down. And so what does it mean in terms of, when we think about decolonizing practices, setting the standard of our contracts with our artists. So thinking about this as being a structural change, not just a program, not just something that Cultural Resources does, or not just one department like education and curriculum, really looking at the structural human resources, the way our administration or governance works. And so we're really thinking about working with artists and what does the artist want, and knowing that they should maintain, this is their intellectual property, so they need to maintain their intellectual property and ownership. We're paying for their work, but we shouldn't own their cultural knowledge of what's going up on the wall. And so we're working with the artists at the moment to finalize some of the details in terms of what that looks like for maintaining their cultural property, what happens when the seismic retrofits happens one day, because we don't own our building, the city owns our building. It's a historic building. And so we can do a lot of things, but if the city says it goes, then we have to follow the city. So we're trying to really think about how do we create structure in so that we can support our Indigenous artists, our non-Indigenous artists, our Black Indigenous communities of color with this structural change, because we shouldn't just be serving ourselves as a museum. Our responsibility is to the community and the cultural resources and the communities that these cultural resources have been stolen from, taken from, like grave robbed from. So I'm going to stop there. I know that was a lot. I'm sorry.
I think the last statement was more important. Grave robbed from.
Yes, definitely. I think this conversation could keep on going and going. It's such an important topic, and I hope in the future we can continue this conversation, because I think there's so much to be said about all that you said, everything, setting standards, community-run spaces. And so that brings us into, community-run spaces, and how does that look like? In the past, we've discussed elements of Chicanx identity and culture, such as the resistance and affirmation. And today we're adding to that self-determination. There are many lessons to take from decolonization, and one of those is the goal of control. Being in control of resources, deciding what is best, determining when, how, and why, and doing so for the benefit of one's own community and not someone else's profit or power. This is a perfect transition to the next topic of Chicanx Run Spaces. Celia Rodriguez will begin with you. You are the co-founder and co-director of Las Maestras Center for Chicana Indigenous Thought and Art and Social Practice at UC Santa Barbara, a center that has been a long time coming. Would you tell us about Las Maestras, your mission, and what it means to have a center of thought and practice and be able to fully determine the directions and the focus, the input and the output? How does Las Maestras play a role in the conservation and preservation of Chicana culture?
Well, thank you very much, Magdalena. And first, I wanted to say, when we came into the space, we said we don't have a mission because we're not missionaries, so we really, and I'm serious in terms of our language, really looking at what Las Maestras Center, why we called it Las Maestras Center of Chicana Indigenous Thought, Art, and Social Practice, because there's so much language and yet so, the definition, the specificity, what I call our homework, is what brought us, into this work. As my co-founder and director, Sheree Moraga, and myself both have been practicing artists, for over 40 years. And this gave us an opportunity to find that institutional support in which we could, continue to document the work, to archive the work, to, begin to, in a sense, articulate, in public what we've been doing in the privacy of Chicano spaces. Because if I can be so bold as to say that the reason most artists who teach at the university level teach in Chicano studies, they teach in Latinx studies. Why? Because for the most part, we are not, being allowed. We're not allowed into the art spaces, art history spaces. There's very few of us. When I start my classes, I always say to my students, there's policy in California that could only be one Chicana artist per 1,000 square miles. If you have one, that's it. You one sculptor, one painter. You won't have a painter and a printmaker and an art historian. And so you need all of them. And so most of us who teach end up teaching in Chicano studies, and we have been there. And if you think about it, I came to school in 1970, I'll date myself, to a program that was full. In terms of ethnic studies, we had a Native American artist, two Native American artists, 3 Chicano artists. We were, in fact, African American artists, we were rich at the moment compared to where we are now. So I ask you, if you look in the departments across California, UC and state system, and see over the last 40 years, who has been teaching, how many, what has been the development of teaching? In other words, those initial artists brought to us by our community protests, by young people demanding to have cultural representation in the schools from 69 to now. Has there been a repetition, and those positions, as they became senior positions, as people retired, was there a dedication to continuing keeping those positions? And so now we're in worse shape than we were back in 69.
Yeah.
So for our students who can't see themselves reflected, and also then when they go to the specificity and say Chicanx, they want to study, they're always pushed into Latin American studies, Latin American art. They're always told to broaden their perspectives so they can get jobs. And so the specificity goes missing. So when we say Chicanx indigenous perspective, what do we mean by that? That's our work in bringing to the table those folks that have been in practice as artists. And really, when we think about indigenous perspective, we don't make walls between the arts, whether it's spoken, whether it's made, in our hands. And we also take the perspective that as practitioners in community, it's our touching and making that really reflects our theory. And so, of course, to hold on to those ideas has been really difficult since the beginning. The idea of Chicanx has always been in resistance. We always say we've been on a living road. We are the living road that continues. And so that's how we look at the work, and in terms of bringing people in that help us and articulate what that means, and documenting, as you were saying, all the things that, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, I was asking other artists, have you had mid-career exhibitions? Are you collected? Are you documented? Do you have insurance? Are you able to teach and pass on information? Many of the artists that have formed are forming in spaces like Chicano Park, are forming in Chicanx spaces, Latinx spaces. That's where they go for mentoring. So even though you pay for a university education, your real education happens in community. And that's good. There's something really healthy and good about that I feel like in terms of what we conserve, as you were saying earlier, I forget who was speaking. I think it was Brandi. You were saying the relationship to community is where the learning happens, where culture is made. And so when I hear words like, cultural property, I take a step back a little bit and I think, is that really how we want to think about it? I know we're defending because things get snatched so easily, but I also think about, I was looking for a word and I found the term ishipla, which means, the result of our intellectual, spiritual work, which is what really is being held. And all of us agree that for that to be alive, right, it has to be able to be held and touched and formed and will change and continue to change. And that's part of the challenge. How do we have that relationship in community? So right now, we're dealing with institutions that think about what they hold and as theirs, and not something that's alive and needs to, maybe even break. So I think those are the challenges that we at Maestro Center, like by bringing in folks and elders, like, the conversations we've had with people that are leaving, are valuable to us. We're now, it's taken us a while to figure out how to do things because we don't have this training. We're just trying to figure out like what is our work? What matters for us as maestros, as teachers, as people, as artists who have been engaged intellectually and also in practice. What matters. So we're speaking now to the library on campus, the SEMA collection, trying to figure out how do we do this. And also we get challenged by some of the maestros we brought, who say, wait a minute, who's holding on to our palabra, and who has access to it. And so we have to then negotiate, some of the maestros who yes, they've allowed us to record them because they trust us. But then the second question is, how will this be used? And so those are some of the issues at the university that we are in fact aware of, that we are at the university. We're so blessed in that the social science and English department are interested, in the work that we're doing as a center. We're actually located in the English department and in the humanities and fine arts with the partnership in social science. And so I'm located in Chicanic Studies and Cherie Moraga's located in English. And so it allows us space and it allows us, when we say the word self-determination, it means that we need the time to figure things out as we move, as we think, as we do, we need the space where we figure things out. And that aspect of it is, in the face of a lot of, I think, criticism and suspicion. Who are we on this road? And so I think those are our tasks. And we welcome you to come visit and participate. I think we're, as Josie was saying, we've walked into this only seeing the tip of the iceberg, and realizing how much work there is to be done. And I guess both of us say, geez, it would have been great to have come at this at 40, as we walked into it, at this age, where yes, we have a lot of information, but the energy and the creativity, the energy for the creativity, we're counting on the folks that come, our students, people that want to participate with us. So I want to thank you for this panel because it allows us to have a conversation that was a little bit unexpected. It's wonderful. I guess that's how we produce knowledge, right? We walk into it, sometimes backwards. So I want to thank you very much.
I have one comment. One of the things that Celia said was very important. Who owns our stuff? And one lesson that I learned from Judy Baca years ago, when SEMA was collecting and when UCLA was collecting, and Judy said, oh, hell no, I'm not sticking my stuff in those archives. And she created her own online archive, which opened my eyes to a whole different perspective, because even though Salvadoreña collecting for SEMA was right on in terms of collecting all the centros in California, what no one explained to us as artists was, once your artwork goes into an archive, it ain't coming out. Your artwork needs to be in a museum, not an archive.
Yes.
So that has really triggered me in my direction with the museum, because we're creating a museum and an archive. Archives for papers and documents, you know, and things of that nature, and you know, other things too. But the museum needs to collect art so that we can own our own, as Celia just said, our own material, to have palabra over it.
Great, thank you. This brings such an important topic and conversation. Who owns our art or stuff, right? And I want to talk about just the future of what this conversation can move into, and how this conversation can move forward. There are efforts underway now to ensure that in the future, the cultural workforce reflects the demographics of our communities. So I want to ask Alessandra about your work as the director of the San Diego Mesa College Museum Studies program. Would you tell us about your work there, and how you help train the next generation of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and why it's important to have diversity and representation in these programs?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. And I think this ties with a lot of the things that Celia has been talking about, and also Josie and Brandi. So I've been at Mesa for 20 years, and we have a pretty unique program. We actually have a museum studies program within a community college. And this has opened up a lot of opportunities specifically for students of color who previously really have not had access to that world. And I have modeled my program really based on what I learned working with Judy Baca. And I went to UCLA, you know, and after my bachelor's, I was Judy Baca's assistant, and I worked with her at Spark. And at Spark, I not only learned, you know, to work with her painting murals, but I learned all the skills, you know, the project management skills, the archiving skills, the writing grant skills, the presentation skills that are so important for preserving, you know, for running an arts organization, a museum. And so what I realized is that there's a huge gap, you know, in university world, in the academic world, they teach you to read about the past. They teach you, you know, to paint, but they don't really teach you how to be a member of the real world, you know, and how to be an active agent in the world. And this is a bigger problem when you are a student of color, where you're coming from an immigrant background, working class background, and the fact that we didn't have, you know, we didn't have those mentors or role models. Now it's changing. Obviously, universities, you know, I have a lot of Chicano colleagues. But what I do in my program is I really, you know, work with my students to introduce them to the world, not only of the museums, but I feel, to me, community cultural arts organizations like the Centro Cultural de la Raza here, like Spark, you know, like, you know, Self-Help Graphics are as important, you know, or in preserving, you know, culture as the museums. So I take a two-pronged approach. You know, I train the students, yes, if they want to work in the museum, but I also feel it's as important for them to be the next leaders in also the community cultural organizations. And the other thing that I want to say is that some of the obstacles that we face is that in training the next generation of Chicanos, of Indigenous, of, you know, African American, you know, leaders, is that, for example, internships, you know, are not paid. So a student who is coming from a background where they have to work, and go to school, for them to take an unpaid internship in a museum or an arts organization, that is not tenable. And that's why those opportunities are then closed and are only accessible to those who have the means, who are privileged, who have the money and can take those internships. So those are some of the things that I'm trying to change. So I train my students in a way that they're ready to go into a museum, to enter into a museum after a year working with us in the art gallery at Mesa College, working directly with artists, working with our arts collection. We have a world arts collection in the gallery, and then I have them go into the different organizations and give them those project management tools, those presentation tools that they need, that are so important. But also I hope that we can increase those resources available to them so that they can follow that path.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. I do want to circle back to Josie. You have you have had tremendous impact on so many efforts. We'd love to hear about the Chicano Park Museum. Would you tell us about the museum, its vision, and what you're most excited about? And how will the museum play a role in localizing your efforts in conservation and preservation of Chicanx culture, and how the role the museum will play into creating a space to practice art administration and cultural practice for Chicanx folks?
Yes, thank you. The Chicano Park Museum and Cultural Center primarily focuses on Chicano, Chicana, Latina, Latino, Mexicano, Mexicana, all the AE, EXE, and indigenous art of the Americas, but specifically of the borderlines and more specific of Logan Heights, AKA that they've defined as Barrio Logan. I think what is important to us, the focus is on, like I said, art history and science. We have a gallery, we have an archive, and I'm looking at another space because I quickly realized we don't have enough space for our archive. We will be doing connecting to the online archive as well, the international online archive. But specifically, what we've been able to do at the museum so far, we're scheduled to open, I would say, either late summer or the fall. We've been spending a lot of time remodeling the facility and just kind of taking out all the bad energy that's gone through that building. We did a ceremony recently with the Chichimecas of a fire ceremony, and then here in Denver, another fire ceremony to celebrate the 52 years of Chicano Park, celebrated April 22nd, 1970. So if anybody starts talking to you about Earth Day, remember Earth Day was the founding of Chicano Park in San Diego, California. So just keep that in mind. We were fortunate recently to obtain a legislative request that was approved by the governor and is filtering through two state agencies, the California Arts Council and Caltrans. We were awarded $10 million, 7.5 for the museum and 2.5 for mural restoration. And we're working to try to sort all of that out right now to get those resources in, but we will be doing national search for an executive director, assistant director, curator, assistant curators, an archivist, maybe two archivists, assistant archivists, all the positions that you can imagine that fit into that whole spectrum of building a museum and maintaining a high professional standard. So I think we're at a pivotal point right now with the museum. What has been really good and important is that our board right now is pretty much community-based board, and that we are establishing a number of different partnerships in the state, and in particular in Logan Heights. We've been able to do programming since 2016. We didn't have a building at that time. We partnered with other cultural centers around the area. There's an organization called Bread and Salt Via Internacional, the Logan Heights Library. So we began doing programming each year to start documenting our current, how do you say it? Our elders before they were leaving. We did our first event 2016, and we partnered with an organization that's part of the San Diego libraries. They're called Libros. And what they do is they enhance library access, facility, and outreach. And when they partnered with us, they set up at our event, brought in scanners so that we began, and then we set up a screen where we brought in elders, and we were documenting their, scanning their photographs and then doing interviews with them so that we can consistently start to collect before many of these elders start to pass. And and that was a good thing, because elders, as all of us know, we're all leaving. And so we were trying to capture as much as we could before we left. One of our first, and everything's been done volunteer so far. I've gotten some resources from the California Arts Council for programming, but everything's been volunteer. The first event we had, Chunky Sanchez, who is a was a renowned national fellow, recognized by the National Endowment of the Arts, played for us, and we were able to document him and collect. And then that was the last event that he did publicly. He died a few months after that. So I think it's really critical right now that we continue to capture and preserve what we've been doing. We partnered with the University of San Diego. We have a bus. We have a big RV bus that's wrapped in Chicano Park murals, where we set up, and we've set up in the parking lot of Chicano Park with an awning and chairs, and we did a whole lecture series on, not a lecture series, but we brought in people dealing with gentrification, because the area is becoming gentrified very quickly. Some of us have participated also, like on the planning group in the area. We were operating still off of a plan from 1979. So we've used the bus to inform community and to reignite interest. I'm going off of that planning board right now, but thankfully, because we started talking to people a long time ago, a whole next generation of activists are now impacting that board. So we have plans to continue to work with the community and inform them, because our community, many of our community, working class, like Alessandra said, they don't have time for non-paid fellowships or to get on these boards and things. So they have to be cultivated and understand the significance of what that means. And where we can, and where I've used of our little resources we've had so far, because we don't have that 10 million yet, is to really work with the next generation and get them into positions so that they can then do community outreach with their colleagues and bring them in. Because, frankly, everybody's saying to me, well, you should be the director. No, I'm not going to be the director, because I'm too old. We need young blood. We need somebody that's going to stay for 5, 10, 20 years. I may be dead tomorrow. I mean, as Celia said, dating myself, I mean, I was involved in Chicano Park in 1970. I mean, that tells you how old. I just turned 70 years old. And I don't got another 52 years. When we lit the fire recently to close down the past 52 years and open up for the next 52 years, we knew for a fact those of us that were there are not going to be there the next 52 years. But, in terms of the museum, that evening, we collected the bundles, and they're documented, and they represent the next 52 years. We took them into the museum. We have 3 separate HVAC systems to maintain the climate control in the collecting room, in the archive room, in the gallery, but also for the facility itself. I mean, there's just so much to talk about the things that we're doing. I mean, I could bore you for hours, but I think to understand what we're trying to focus on is really generating the interest from the next generation and getting them to look at preservation, and maybe even not using all of these words like conservancy or preservation, because when you say that to a local community, sometimes they're looking at you and their eyes are rolling over because they don't understand what the heck you're talking about. So you need to bring it down to a level, and I don't mean down because we're really bright and we've been collecting. And the fortunate thing that we have with the museum right now is that Tommy Camarillo, who's been the chairwoman of the Chicano Park Steering Committee for the last 30 years, has recently stepped down. We have a new chairperson now who's Lucas Cruz, but she, as a local archivist, began collecting early on because she, she just had it within her that she knew that every time she had to deal with the city or the state or anything, she had to go back and find those source materials that said they were going to do this and they never did it. And so she has in her house, it looks like a library. She has binders for everything. And, many of the universities around the area have been trying to collect her collection. And she's made an agreement to us to begin scanning all of those documents so that we can put the original documents in a climate controlled environment, because not just focused on Chicano Park, she's got material for all the organizations in the area. I mean, I was recently contacted by the Chicano Federation, which is a social service organization, because they had no records of themselves. And I went to Tommy, she had 10 boxes of records. I took them all and I gave them to them because that's what they needed. And we, I've recently obtained a grant that's part of the United States Latino Digital Humanities, so that I can begin scanning at least the first small portion of her collection that we can then interface to the online archives and connect to other areas. And we're hoping that that will turn into a bigger source of resources that we can document her whole collection. And what I would like in the museum, that our archive in the museum actually is her collection at some point. So that when we obtain this other facility that we're looking at, that we can put that stuff over there. And then this could be to highlight the collection of the Tommy Camarillo collection, because we are the Chicano Park Museum and Cultural Center. That is her collection of Chicano Park and its history. And so, I get people calling me. I realized quickly that what I had in this space was not going to work. I've got elders calling me. I've got boxes and boxes and boxes and books and books and books. And I was going, oh my God, I don't know what to, I'm not going to be able to handle all of this. So, the planning has been slow, but very strategic, if you will, of the community coming in and saying, we want this, or we want that, and we don't want this, and we don't want that. And I'm trying to honor all of that so that, and my board, I have a really strong working board. So anyway, I guess I'll leave you all with is, this conversation is, we're really looking to support the next generation and hire people who have conciencia and are committed to preserving the work of Chicano Latino along the border region area. And I guess I'll leave it at that. We can continue talking. I like I said, I could bore you for hours.
It's definitely not boring. It's so interesting. I mean, I definitely want to hear more about the Chicano Park Museum in as we move forward. But I am gonna switch gears a little bit and talk about the conservation a little bit. So in order to have representation of all cultures in the museum and art world, the work that happens in museums in front and behind the scenes needs to be accessible and reflective of all cultures. I think we can all agree on that. It's important in this work to demystify these fields. So for conservation in particular, a field that has long occurred away from the public's view and for many reasons remained inaccessible, the work of demystifying and creating community connections can be all that more rewarding. So Bianca, I'm gonna move to you. In addition to being the Associate Conservator of Paintings at the Balboa Art Conservation Center and the project manager for this fantastic series of conversations on conservation. You're also the program manager for the Andrew W. Mellon Opportunity for Diversity and Conservation, an initiative of the UCLA Getty program in the conservation of cultural heritage that supports funded opportunities for students interested in conservation who are from backgrounds that are historically underrepresented in this field. Would you tell us about this work, the program, your work, your goals, the goals of the organization, and what you get most excited about, and also what can folks benefit from this program and how can they get involved?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited about both the work that I do for BACC, but what I like to fondly call job two, which is my position as program manager for the Andrew W. Mellon Opportunity for Diversity and Conservation. And this is a really important initiative. I think anecdotally, we've always talked about the field of conservation is predominantly non-Hispanic white, but do we have the data for this? And back in 2015, and then again in 2018, the Mellon Foundation conducted a survey of institutions and positions of leadership and found that conservation is 89% non-Hispanic white. So if we can talk at length about the issues of lack of representation in the field of cultural heritage and who gets to have a say in the decision-making process and how conservation is approached for objects of different cultural backgrounds. So increasing diversity and representation in the field is really important. And that's one of the reasons why we're also having these conversations. So getting all these different cultural perspectives and making people more conscious about the issue and starting these conversations so that we can then move in the direction that we all want to move, such as the work that Brandi has been doing with the Museum of Us. So the Mellon program, the Mellon Diversity and Conservation Program, it's a two-part program. So we do a lot of outreach at college level. So we work with undergraduate students, but also recent graduates to introduce them to the field of conservation. Most people have never heard about this, or if they have, they've seen some social media posts of someone say like cleaning a painting, or we all know the unfortunate incident with Monkey Jesus, and that's kind of what sticks with people. So we bring in students who might be from related specialties like studio art or art history, ethnic studies, because we understand the wealth of cultural knowledge that they bring to cultural preservation, but also chemistry. There's a lot of science in conservation. And so it's by application, we bring them into Los Angeles to UCLA Getty, and we hold this intense summer workshop for 15 to 18 students, depending on funding for the year. And we just introduce them to conservation, what it means, all the different specialties, but also we bring in invited instructors, and we try to prioritize that they are BIPOC as well, and have them talk about their journey into the field, how they got interested, what their path was, and what some of the work that they're doing is. So the goal is to demystify the profession and have them have a better understanding of what the work entails. At the end of the workshop, everyone is invited to apply for the second portion of the program, which is an internship. And that's the really critical part. So in order to apply for graduate school, and the goal of the program is to increase diversity and representation in the field of conservation. So by mentoring students who will then go on to apply to a graduate program in conservation, graduate and become conservators working at all these institutions that we all admire and visit daily. So after the summer workshop, they're invited to apply for the second portion, which is this internship. And it's a fully funded internship. And we work with the different participants to understand what specialties they might be interested. And for most people, this would be the first time that they're going into conservation. So they may just have a general idea of, I like paintings, or I love objects. And this is a chance for them to explore these interests at institutions where sometimes most of us dream of ever like being a lowly paid intern there. And we try to place them so that they continue this mentoring journey into the field that they think they want to go into, the specialty. And after that, we do also a lot of mentoring, because after the internship's over, then it's what's next. You need to get more experience. You probably need to take pre-programmed classes. You need to build a portfolio. And these are not things that are intuitive to most people. The field of conservation, I feel like it's has a lot of hoops to jump through that most of us, like once you first learn about it, it can be overwhelming and daunting, but we handhold you through the process and trying to explain and for people to understand what their place in it is. So like I said, we focus on outreach to undergraduate students, and we try to pique their interest in the field, expose them through the workshop and all these funded opportunities, and that they can get experience, because we understand, and it's really important for us that these are funded, because we understand that volunteering is a luxury for most people. So, and that's what's kept the field at such in the state that it is. It's so underrepresented for so many other communities. So we work towards diversifying the field in the hopes of increasing representation in the pipeline of prospective students. And the first workshop was held in 2017. Obviously, COVID kind of put a pause to it, but we've now had 6 program participants who've been successfully accepted into graduate programs for conservation, both in the United States and abroad. And we have many others who are now working towards or planning to apply next year, who have, after our internship, they've gone on to be accepted at other internship programs, both at the Getty, at the Smithsonian, things like that. So we're trying to get everyone everywhere, slowly spreading our tentacles into all these different cultural institutions. And we also acknowledge that not everyone who goes through the program will end up going into conservation. So of those 15 to 18 participants that we have, we only accept 6 for the internship. But we understand that for those who don't go into conservation, they decide, well, I really liked our history, I'm gonna continue with curatorial work. Or we've had students who, I'm thinking specifically of one case, her part-time job in college was working for FedEx, and she really enjoyed the logistics of shipping and handling and doing all these things, and working through the program exposed her to, oh, there are people in museums who also do similar work, who are air handlers, art shippers. That totally fascinated her. So participating in the program exposes, we don't focus just on conservation, but we also expose participants to all the different allied professionals, all the different professionals that make an institution work, right? Like conservators don't work in a bubble. So we talk to museum educators, we talk to the registrars, the curators, exhibition designers, all of these work hand in hand with conservators. So for those who decide conservation is not the career path for them, you're gaining allied professionals who understand now conservation, who we've demystified the field for them, and they understand the important contributions of BIPOC cultural workers at large, and what resources are available to them and how they can work with conservators. So this is part of the work that excites me about this program, working with emerging professionals, seeing them connect with their own cultural knowledge, and that's something that we really stress in the program. We ask every participant to bring in an object of personal significance, and most often it ends up being an heirloom of their family. Like we've had grandmother's wedding shoes, birth certificates, all kinds of things, really special. And I think we all connect with these items that we hold in our houses. You know, they each represent a person, a family, a whole culture and society at large in one single item. Like you can learn so much, but sometimes we're not used to understanding them from a material perspective. So seeing them explore these objects that they're so familiar with throughout kind of like growing up with them in their lives, and explore through a single object, not just the materials and all the complexity of creating this single object, but also the complexity of the ethical decision-making process that conservation requires. Because understanding how much something can hold, then it really gets you thinking of, oh, so what I do to this object, how I care for it is also important. And it must come with its own set of like cultural, sensitive and responsive approaches to it. And that's the goal of both our program, I think the direction in which the field of conservation is moving, and also one of the reasons why we're having these series of panel conversations, right? It's, okay, like focusing now on the Chicanx community, how can we start developing and exploring what some of these ethical considerations are for this community, and how the field of conservation can be better informed. So I love my work. It allows me to connect not just my job one, which is at BACC, and I get to do hands-on work in conservation, but with job two as program manager for the Mellon Diversity and Conservation Initiative, it's then bringing my work and bringing in others to join me in the work that I do, and how collectively eventually we will build a more diverse future generation of conservators. So I think how people can get involved. Unfortunately, we just accepted the cohort for this upcoming summer, but so towards the end of this year, we will be posting the application. So for next year, for program participants who can apply. Yeah, thanks. I think that's it.
Great, thank you. Josie, please.
Well, I just have two comments. Thank you, Bianca. I think what you said was extremely important. And one of the things that stayed with me is that, you know, underrepresentation. And I've got to say, Leticia, I'm so happy that you're the director of Balboa Art Conservancy because, and I must say, I take my hat off to the board because I didn't think they would hire a Latina, Chicana, indigenous person, you know, and because I never even saw them working with our community in the past. And I think what you're bringing forward is extremely important. And, you know, we're underrepresented because no one ever valued us as a community. You know, I just saw something here. Denver did this really great storytelling. You can go online, YouTube, and it talks about, there's one statement that just knocked my socks off is they said, you know, when Denver was being founded, that there was no racism. And I almost swallowed my tongue because I thought to myself, well, what happened to the natives that were here? You know, what do you mean there was no races? You just put your city right on top of centuries of community. And I think that's the mentality. And I don't mean to put down Denver. It's a beautiful city. And I think what they're doing here is really fantastic. But I think it's just reflective of what they thought of our communities, the indigenous communities, and especially the Latino, Latina, Chicano, Chicana, you know, Raza communities, because they never valued us. They only saw us without realizing this was our land and it was on top of the natives' land. And they never put any significance to what we had to offer. And I think that's why we're underrepresented. And I think that's why we're at a pivotal point right now in terms of preservation and conservation.
Yes, definitely. I just want to share something personally. I forgot to mention earlier who I am other than the moderator. I'm a third-year graduate fellow in the Art Conservation Department from the Winter University of Delaware program. And I'm a Chicana first generation. My parents migrated here in the 80s, and so it's been interesting navigating these spaces. And I think conservation, I think in general, has been doing a good job. You know, I've been seeing a lot of more of these initiatives, like the one that Bianca's working with, and just a couple of different museums are focusing on increasing accessibility. And I think that's just incredible. But, you know, I think museums in general do have a long way to go. And it's been challenging, you know, navigating these spaces, going into academia as well has been, you know, dealing with microaggressions has been something that, you know, coming from a background, you know, I grew up in Southern California and around LA County, the Inland Empire. And I think all these spaces, you know, I felt kind of at home. And so, going into a space now that it's a little bit more, it's obviously less diverse, especially conservation, but, you know, I'm happy to share that it has being in this field even opened my eyes to wow, this needs something, this needs a lot of work. And so I'm just happy to know that it's moving forward in the right direction, like with the conversation that's happening now. And you know, I just hope more people get involved and you know, because it just makes our work much more rewarding. And just the personal experience. I remember one time I worked on this exhibition from at the couple of years ago at the Getty Museum about luxury and legacy, called Golden Kingdom's Luxury and Legacy in the ancient Americas. And you know, I was there condition checking all 300, well, with a lot of conservators assisting in condition checking sacred objects for this exhibition. And I always wondered, when was the last time, these objects were lent to us from many institutions, and, a lot of them were from institutions in the places where they belonged, but then a lot of them also came from places like, museums and institutions in Europe. And so I always wondered about those. When was the last time those were cared for by somebody whose ancestors these belonged to? And so I think that was something that's been really eye-opening, and I think increasing our visibility and diversity, and it's just going to make the work that we do much more enriching, and for the objects as well, and for the stories that we tell, it's just going to be much more incredible. So finally, I do want to ask Leticia, the executive director of the Balboa Art Conservation Center. She's done incredible work there already and is undergoing what you've called the radical transformation. Yes, round of applause. And the main goal for this is to make it more accessible and inclusive. Can you tell us a little bit about this transformation? What are you most excited about, and how will this make the cultural workforce more diverse?
Thank you, Magdalena, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to try my best to keep this short, as I have like hours and hours and hours of response to all of your amazing contributions. But to start, I will say that, Josie, I share in your shock and your surprise that I am now the executive director of a art conservation and cultural preservation institution, particularly because, and I love saying this when I am invited to conservation tables, I have no background in conservation. I have a ton of background in cultural preservation as a mode of survival and resistance as a Chicana, but not in conservation the way that BACC has practiced it in the past. And it would come at no surprise to learn that the field of conservation, when we talk about it in this box, is 94% white. There is little representation, there is little diversity and inclusion, there is little acknowledgement that there is preservation and conservation happening outside of that box by communities. So when you bring someone like me with a background in activism and advocacy and engagement and community engagement into an institution like this and into a field like this, my first and main and forever job will always be to disrupt. So that's what I've been doing for the past year and a half. And it's been working really well. I think there is so much for the field to learn about other ways to approach this work. And I think as we're having this conversation now today, and the three conversations we've had over the past 3 weeks, it is obvious that there are two kinds of conservations. There is institutional conservation, which is what we talk about when we talk about the field and getting your master's. And then there is the conservation that we do in our communities. And it by no means is under or some kind of elementary version of institutional conservation. I think the acknowledgement, and this is one of the radical shifts, and it shouldn't be radical, but it is, that BACC is engaging in, is acknowledging that the field has so much to learn about how we approach this work, how we define conservation and preservation, and to acknowledge that communities like the Chicano community have been engaging in cultural preservation for millennia. This is how we have survived. This is why we are here. And we don't need anybody to come and teach us how to do it. We need folks who feel that they are in some kind of privileged institutional space where it has already been designated. This is a proper way to do it, to acknowledge and understand that this is how we caretake for our culture, for our materials, for our cultural production. And Celia, I loved that you talked about what self-determination means, is having the luxury of time and space to be able to do this, and not necessarily being driven by this idea of production and property, right? Like, it doesn't always have to lead to tangible, that our culture goes beyond that, and pushing the field of conservation to think beyond the box that it's currently in, and make room for us has been really rewarding. But also understanding that we need to be part of both. right? That we need folks from our community in the institutions. We need them in the master's programs. We need more Magdalenas. And when the Magdalenas get there, we need to support them and see them all the way through and remind them that we're here, that there are Chicano Park museums and Las Maestras places to go to continue kind of growing in this knowledge and continue opening and sharing and disrupting it at all levels. So for me, engaging with this work at BACC, pushing the field to rethink the way it has done things in the past is only the beginning. And I keep saying this, and when I say this, I mean it's only the beginning for BACC, because I fully acknowledge that this work has been happening for a long time in our communities, and we need to catch up. Institutions need to catch up. BACC is, as a historically white-led, white-serving institution, the field of conservation as a historically exclusively white-led, white-serving field needs to catch up. And I think over the past 4 weeks, all of this engagement that we've been doing, all of these conversations that we've been having have not been for us, for BACC or the field, to teach communities how to do conservation work. It has been to learn how to better do conservation work and how to approach conservation work ourselves. So thank you for all of your giving and your intention and your patience with fields like this one, but also invitation to continue challenging and pushing back and helping me and us disrupt these longstanding kind of flows and motions of work and thought and knowledge. And I definitely look forward to continue doing that in communion with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Leticia. Very well said. Now we are at noon, but I did want to just wrap up. If you have to go, the panelists, please, by all means. But I did want to wrap up our panel with a thought. We thought it would be appropriate to invite everyone to help us set intentions. And thank you, Leticia, for mentioning that intentions, their goals, dreams, visions. And we wanted to take a moment to verbalize where you wish to be, in hopes that setting these out helps us get closer to manifesting. So we invite you all here on the panel and out in the audience to take a moment and envision with us. What does tomorrow look like for our community? Where are we? What resources do we have? And what knowledges have we attained? And what does cultural preservation look like for our community? So I would like to just start off with Josie. Would you mind sharing maybe an intention with us, if you have any?
Circle back to me, please.
Okay.
Let me give it a moment of thought so that I'm a little bit more clear.
Leticia, I'll start with you.
Okay, I think I kind of set my intentions already, but really my goal is to bring us from intention into practice. So I set my intentions when I walk into work every day. When, as a woman of color in this field, my mere presence disturbs and disrupts, I remind myself that I belong here. And I take up all the elbow room that I can to make room for all kinds of other folks to come and join. My vision for a future for us, not just for the field of conservation, but for our society, is that we all have access to the resources that we need. We mentioned earlier about how there are, bigger institutions that have access to funding and materials and time and resources and space, and how communities like ours need to tap into those. But Alessandra, you said it really beautifully about having that tapping in and having that tapping in be community led, because it could very quickly be jeopardized when it's not in the right hands and it's not with the right intentions, right? So we have to put both of our feet forward and take charge and just kind of be in the forefront whenever these opportunities do arise, so that we can make use of these resources in a way that benefits our communities.
Thank you. I will jump in and say my intention is inspired by a previous talk that I heard from one of our panelists, Brandi about talking about decolonization, where in a previous conversation I heard you had mentioned we need to check our egos. And so I think that's something that I'm gonna hold, and because as conservators, I feel like that's something that we need to apply just immensely in our field. So that's going to be my intention. Brandi, would you jump in, please?
That's so nice of you. Now my mind is lost. So I thank you. I think of maybe about my intentions. Museums are hostile. They were built, they stole our items, our ancestors. And so I try and walk into work to make sure that I'm honoring the ancestors and the people that came before me to fight for my type of position today, and to make sure that it's the positions like these will continue to be in the field for the next generations, because it's hard. It's even hard today. And then I think about it in terms of, when I think about conservation and preservation, is what does it look like in terms of our ideologies from where we sit and how we sit? Because we know how to take care of our items. Our ancestors knew how to take care of our items. So maybe it's not an acid-free box. Maybe it's a box with, leather and tobacco and whatever offering our community says is supposed to be there next to the ancestor, because that is our way. And I think that where I see it in terms of thinking about the future and setting the intentions is making sure that is the best practices, not what they think the best practice is, because that's a colonial paradigm. And also building relationships with folks like y'all. And just thank you, Magdalena, for touching my heart as well.
Oh, thank you. No, you've all been so inspirational. I'm gonna jump to Bianca. Bianca, would you mind sharing an intention?
Yeah, I think I would like to see representation beyond the bench work. Conservators can do hands-on work, but we exist in so many other different roles and positions, and it's these decision-making positions that need to have increased representation, like from program managers, like funders, oh my gosh, like directors. So it's a whole system that needs, and I would like for it to not be tokenized. Like, it's not just about hiring the people. Now we've increased diversity, but like Cecilia have said, like, it's a whole process, and Brandi's also talked about this. So we need to reevaluate what some of these toxic, like, environment rules that we set up on ourselves are, and how can we just change them? Like, that's my intention.
Thank you. Alessandra, would you mind sharing an intention with us?
Sure. Well, I just have to say that being spaces like this is what gets me excited about the future. I kind of go to work every day with a feeling of what can we change, but the idea of kind of resisting and imagining new ways, and also a feeling of kind of radical joy in bringing together the people that can work with us in this. So I'm just looking forward to collaborating. I know that I've had conversations with Bianca, with Leticia, with Brandi, with Josie, because we're here in San Diego, and I just see things coming together, and I'm looking of ways that I can learn from you, all of you, and help and guide my students and help the artists here in the community.
Thank you, Alessandra. Celia, would you mind sharing an intention with us, please?
Well, I try to hold on to my intentions like I do prayers, just keep walking them, keep moving them along. But I remember that I did a project with the Chochenyo Ohlone, represented by Karina Gold. The project was, from San Francisco Arts Council, the Creative Work Fund. We were funded to actually make things visible within the Chochenyo Ohlone community. But the point is that most of their things had been taken away, to Russia and to England. So we were given the opportunity to take a group, and I took a group of people, invited, and they came, a child the age of 5 and an elder in her 80s. And we went to the British Museum to consult the spirit of their baskets because, nothing was at home. And it was an eye-opening, heart-opening, wrenching experience as to what the British Museum thought of themselves as ready to receive a delegation that came to consult. And we did consult the spirit, not to look, but to consult, the spirit of the makers of what was contained in those baskets. And it was, it was really moving. I think the point of it is that to see, and all of us noted, everything being held hostage in the back storerooms, and how much life there was. And as Ruth Horta, the elder said, her first thought was to apologize, to the basket, and to say, I'm sorry it took us so long to come after you. And I can't help but think about that, in terms of what we're experiencing right now with our children locked up, bereft of the culture, that there's a connection between what's, locked up behind glass, and what's locked up behind chain link. That's our future. And so, the idea then to be able to note that the elder knew right away what to say to the spirit, how to open that door, and that we had a child that could be witness to that. That's the future. So I feel like that my intention then is dialogue. I feel it's so imperative at this moment because we are at this very important juncture, that we do speak to each other. And I'm so grateful for this panel. And I hope to be able to continue as a practicing artist, as a person who really, is engaged in thinking, who are we as Chicana, as Indigenous peoples? What is our relationship? How are we going to continue in the face of, everything that we are looking at right now, including technology? And, how do then we bring ourselves into conversation so that we can, imagine and practice self-determination? Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderfully said. Josephine, would you like to share an intention?
Yes, I would say, I think we need to continue to walk in beauty, walk on the earth, but not be among all the negativity, so that we hold on to what's significant to us and our communities. I was complaining recently to somebody. I said, why does everything have to be a fight? I have to fight for this, fight for that, protect this, fight. And this friend of mine just turned around and she put her hand on my shoulder and she says, no, you're not fighting. She said, you're doing the Creator's work. And I had to stop. I mean, I literally teared up because I thought to myself, she's right. All this work is in front of us and we have to be in present time to deal with it without becoming it. Because when you become it, you lose the focus of what you're doing. So the intention would be to maintain our spiritual connection with regard to the work that we're doing, and then take it one step at a time so that we can share with the next generation all the positive and how to fight and continue to go forward without becoming the fight, so that we don't lose our next generation because of those fights. And I would agree with each and every one of you and all these intentions. I think it's important that we continue to walk in beauty and hold on to our inner communication with Source as we go forward.
Thank you so much. That was wonderfully said. I am going to thank you, everyone. This has been, thank you for joining us. Thank you for our audience. Want to remind everyone that all 4 sessions of the dialogue series are available for viewing on our website. And you can follow the Balboa Art Conservation Center on social media and sign up to their newsletter. to keep up to date with what's next. This is just a conversation that that is only the beginning, as Leticia says. Thank you to the California Humanities and the City of San Diego Commission for Arts and Culture for funding this program. And thank you to the staff and board at the Balboa Art Conservation Center and all the amazing panelists who participated and shared their knowledge with us over the past 4 weeks. And thank you, Bianca and Leticia, for allowing me to moderate this last very impactful, just this wonderful panel. I'm so grateful and honored. Thank you.
Adios.
Adios.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.